And I want to make an announcement for somebody that might not have heard it, that tomorrow night, the program at the Homewood Library is at 6:30 p.m., not a.m., and it has been changed from what was originally publicized because the original presenter had back surgery and didn't feel up to making a presentation. So we'll have Peter Kirchakov, a Russian immigrant. He didn't come from Russia. He came from somewhere, Ukraine. Anyway, he lived under communism for a while, and he's written a couple of books, and he's going to talk about the 900-day siege of Leningrad, which was a turning point in World War II. And so he's really interested in the subject. He's written a book, I think, on the subject, and it will be 6:30 at the library tomorrow. Now, do we have somebody to introduce our speaker? Who's going to introduce our speaker?
Jane, I think.
Jane does that. She's not here?
Well, she's here, but she's around the corner.
Oh, she's around the corner. And so we'll see y'all tomorrow at 6:30 if you can make it.
Larry Lee is an Auburn University graduate who spent his career in both journalism and economic and community development. He's especially interested in rural community development and co-authored 3 publications about rural Alabama and rural schools. He retired in 2011 and today spends most of his time as an advocate for public education. He frequently writes articles about education for both daily and weekly newspapers, and also writes for his blog, which can be found at larryeducation.com. I highly recommend that. I read it every week. He was recognized by the Council for Leaders in Alabama Schools with the Dr. James Street Award for his efforts as an advocate for public schools. Welcome to OLLI.
Thank you, Jane.
Oh, and if you have questions, I'll take that microphone around, speaking to the microphone. As his arm.
I think it is.
If you could hear me, it was, because I don't speak.
Let me take my glasses off so I can read. But you don't want to meet me on the highway with my glasses off, that's for sure. Well, thank y'all for the invitation. This is a great group. I had spoken, was it in this room, Nancy?
Yes.
Spoken, what was it, January, was it a year ago, maybe? It was a bitterly cold day. And I think there was a grand total of 4 of us there. That was Miss Voss, you were talking about Montevallo. I got married, the only time I've ever been married was in Montevallo at the First Baptist Church, and there was as many people at that OLLI gathering as there was at my wedding. There was 4 people, and that included me and the bride and a witness and the preacher. So I guess big things happen with four in the crowd. But let me, first of all, tell you a little bit about myself. And the first thing is that I'm not an educator. The only time I've ever been in classroom, not the only time I've ever been in classroom, but when I was officially in school was when I was a student, like most of y'all were. But back before I retired in 2011, and in 2008, I was working actually for the State Department of Agriculture and Industries there in Montgomery doing rural community development, something I'm very interested in. And we did a study about 10 rural schools that we found that I call them high poverty, high performance schools. And they were on the backside of nowhere. In fact, Nancy's got one of the little booklets. We printed about 10,000 of them, and she has one of the few remaining copies back in the back of the room. But I mean, they were at places like Fruithurst. How many of you ever been to Fruithurst? Nancy, you went. Nancy's been to Fruithurst. Fruithurst is on Old Highway, 78, I guess it is, and about halfway between Heflin and Georgia line. Its claim to fame was that 1,000,000 years ago it was a speed trap. And if you went to Atlanta, you better watch out when you go to Fruithurst. But Fruithurst Elementary School there is a fabulous little school. Christy Hyatt was 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, the principal, and still is. But We looked at schools from Jackson County up into Dutton in Tennessee Valley to all the way to Chalcedebra, a little school in the north end of Mobile County. And what we did, we looked at three different things. We were trying to figure out why these schools, in the face of so many challenges, were thriving. And so we looked at what I call the external environment, and that was my part of it. I had two colleagues working on this with me, and we drove over 10,000 miles visiting these schools. I went to more Native American days and PTA meetings and fall festivals than you could shake a stick at. But we were trying to figure out, one of the things was, we were trying to figure out what impacted that school that was not necessarily taking place in the classroom. You know, how did the community relate to them? And remember, all of these schools had at least 65% free and reduced lunches, and probably higher than that now. We looked at the internal environment, and particularly how did that principal run that school. And Dr. Owen Sweat from over in West Alabama, a former principal, conducted all of that. And what we found was that, this was interesting, 9 of the 10 principals all had the same management style. Now, if you had asked them what it is you do, they couldn't have probably quantified it, but when you put it all together, they were all doing the same general kind of things. And as much as anything, you could say they were people persons. I mean, they believed in a team approach. They were not autocratic. They listened to their staff and did a really good job. The third thing we did, and this was just out of curiosity, we did a Myers-Briggs personality assessment on all the teachers. And we were just curious as to what personality types predominated at those schools. And I'll give you one example. One of the things we learned, and I found this amazing, 98% of the teachers in those schools were introverted. Now, most of the time you think a teacher, because they're the sage on the stage, as we say sometimes, would be an extrovert. But they weren't. And the guy who did all that work, Gerald Carter, I asked him, I said, how do you explain that? And he said, if you're passionate about something, you will flip your personality. You will become somebody you normally are not, just you need an occasion arises. But one of the things that I found interesting, there's 2 personality types. One of them's called thinking and one of them's called feeling. Basically, the feeler would be somebody that would be a teacher like, Dan, I know that your mama likes to drink a little too much. I know your daddy's in jail. And under those circumstances, I think it's just great that you're here at school. So that's kind of the feeler's attitude. The thinker says, Dan, I know about your mama and I know about your daddy. But I think the good Lord probably gave you a brain, and as long as you're in my class, we're going to try to put something in it. And the thinkers have a lot higher expectations. And one of the things that was almost palatable in all of these schools was what I called a culture of expectations. The principal had expectations of the staff had expectations of their kids, and I'm wandering off here, but there's a tremendous difference in the cultures of school. Just like you go to some governmental agencies, or go to, one realty office is run one way and another may be run another way. I mean, everything kind of takes on the image of whoever's at the top. But that was just fascinating, and I really think that that whole thing of culture and climate is something that we probably don't pay near enough attention to. We're so busy trying to do education that we're not interested, or we ignore some of the other things that are very definitely involved. So anyhow, but out of that, what I learned was that we've got people in public schools who are busting their you-know-what. And most of these little schools didn't have the proverbial pot to do you-know-what in. And they were challenged by their communities, by the lack of resources. For instance, and this is a great example, one of the schools was Phil Campbell Elementary up in Franklin County. Jackie Ergel was the principal, and he's still the principal. It was the same size as Wrights Mill Road Elementary in Auburn, as far as number of students. At that time, back when we did the study, I learned that Wrights Mill Road had 100% PTA membership for 21 years. Wow. In other words, every family had joined the PTA, or PTO, I don't remember which one it was called. On the opposite side was Jackie at Phil Campbell, and she had 12 PTA members. Well, the reason is that probably every time I visit a school, I will always ask the principal, guesstimate how many of your kids come from single-parent homes. And the lowest number I've ever heard was 50%. And I've heard it as high as 90%. And it's often 75 or something or other. Okay, you go to Phil Campbell, where there are no jobs. It's not too far from Russellville. But if I'm a single mama and I got a youngin in that school and I'm working, I ain't working in Phil Campbell. And what time do I get home from work? Do I want to go to a meeting at the school? So it's just circumstantial kind of things. So it doesn't mean that mamas and daddies in Phil Campbell don't love their youngins. It just means they're living in a different world. They're in a totally different world. And Jane and I were talking about the world of Mountain Brook. You know, the world of Auburn is an entirely different world in most places too. We talk about how good these schools were. This just went into my mind. The little school at Fruithurst, at that time there were 5, I think, elementary schools in Auburn. The school at Fruithurst had higher math scores than any Auburn elementary school did. And I thought that was somewhat incredible, if you want to know the truth. But they were great places. But anyhow, with a journalism background and a public relations background, I just simply said, I'm going to try to do what little I can to speak on behalf of public schools and the kind of people that I got so knowledgeable of and the things that I saw. Because as I read the paper and heard the news, it seemed like a constant drumbeat of how bad schools are and how lazy teachers are and how, you know, they don't work hard and blah, blah, blah. You know, you've heard all the stuff. And my experience is, and that is true, obviously, in some cases. But, you know, just like all lawyers are not equal, all teachers aren't equal, all doctors aren't equal, the same thing. But I think we got a whole lot more good ones than we do ones that are not so good. So I've said about, and for years I've written op-ed pieces, and I continue to do that some, and then in April of last year started my little blog. You're looking at one of the most non-technical people in the world. I graduated from high school 55 years ago this year. I graduated from Auburn 50 years ago this year. So, you know, I just recently discovered what a wonderful invention an electric pencil sharpener is. I mean, within the last 6 months, I bought me an electric pencil sharpener. Baby, that thing will sharpen them in a heartbeat, I know that. And I'm thinking, why didn't I get one of those before? My phone, which is out in my car, is a flip phone. And somebody the other day sent me an email and said, text me something other. And I'm like, I don't know how to text anybody. So, but anyhow, so I got in the blog business, and then Somebody set up a Facebook page where when I blog something, it automatically goes on the Facebook site. And I'm also on Twitter. I don't even know where you find Twitter. But every day I get something. So-and-so's following you on Twitter. Well, I keep wanting to say, well, if they find out where I am, I hope they can tell me. But, so that's been quite an adventure. But I've started to pay an awful lot of attention to education as a non-educator and real concerned about some things. And I want to start this by giving you two frames of reference. One is there's 730,000 kids in our public schools in Alabama. 730,000. So most of our children in this state are being educated in a public school. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. The other context is that when you look, and I got so many notes here.
Does that include the city schools?
That's everybody. That's public schools.
Okay.
City and county. This is information from the State Department of Education. Obviously, you can't see it, but the context is that we are spending $8,000 million a year. Now, how many is 8,000 million, Dan? It's 8 billion. $8 billion a year from local, federal, and state and other sources is being spent on education in our public schools. That is an amazing amount of money. Yes, sir.
You're talking about K through 12?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's not higher education. K through 12. And let me say, anytime you got a question, just raise your hand and I'll listen. At my age, I know about can't remember something. Yes, sir.
I have two questions.
Yes, sir.
What percentage of the kids are in public schools as opposed to private schools? Do you know that?
No, ma'am, I do not, because it's just finding information, good information on private schools is like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is just not readily available. It's less than 100,000. I know that, and I want to say it's 50 or 60, but I really don't know, because you've got several different private school organizations, and in that most private schools will belong to one or the other, and some of them don't belong to anything. So there's no common information gathering point.
And the second question is, what is the state spending per capita on the kids?
The state number is, it don't hold me to this exactly, about $5,500
Per child.
per child. But that's the state's portion of it. Yeah.
And then there's still federal money.
Ma'am,
And then there's still other money.
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Is there still federal money as well?
Federal money.
Oh, federal money, yes, ma'am. But when you add them all up as to what the total amount is, there's not a tremendous amount of variance in most systems. I mean, from the top to the bottom. Now, you got like Mountain Brook, because of the local support in Hoover and Vestavia, some of those spend a great deal of money from a local support level. But let's see, where am I? So the context, 730,000 children, $8 billion. And the reason I mentioned the $8 billion is because that's a whole lot of vendors. That's a lot of school buses. It's a lot of computers. It's a lot of insurance. It's a lot of software programs. It's a whole bunch of lots of things. And I think that one of the driving forces in some of the things going on in education today is trying to get my hands on some of that money. I think an awful lot of the reform that we hear about really leads to that. That money is every time a lawmaker says to me, I'm doing it for the kids, I just kind of chuckle and say, you're gonna have to work harder to convince me. I'm not really sure about that. Okay. When things really started changing in Alabama was the election of 2010, when we elected the Republican supermajority, and it went into office in, actually in the fall with a special session Governor Riley called in 2010. But I had been, some of you may have heard, and let me just say, I brought a couple books with me, both of them by my friend Diana Rabbit. Some of you may or may not have heard of her. And you can see I've read them and marked them up and that sort of thing. She created a group called the Network for Public Education a number of years ago and invited me to be on the board, which I thought was kind of odd, if you want to know the truth. I used to tell her I was the token redneck because most of the members were professors at University of Texas, or there's all kind of really credentialed people on that board. But we would have a lot of conference calls and talking about spending the majority of our time. Could you get me some water, Nancy, please? We spent a lot of time talking about what was going on in other states. And I kept saying, I can't relate to that. Thank you. And at that point, back about 2010 and 2011, I couldn't, because a lot of the reform effort, the charter schools and vouchers and all that sort of stuff, just hadn't gotten to Alabama at that point in time.
But it was on the way.
Yeah, it was on the way. Anyhow, I'm no longer on that board, and I invited myself off of it because it was sometimes very esoteric. But good people. Okay, so we changed our, we changed the players in Montgomery. And the first significant piece of legislation that we passed was in 2013. It was called the Alabama Accountability Act. And some of you have heard of that. And I have studied it a lot. I got a phone call from a reporter about it all this morning. Now, the Accountability Act was passed on February the 28th of 2013. It was on a Thursday. I remember that because it was a state school board meeting day. I'm almost sure of that. Dr. Bias, Tommy Bias, was a state superintendent. He was at the school board meeting, had no clue that bill was being worked on that day. What they did, they had a bill that dealt with, they called it the flex bill, the flexibility bill. It dealt with giving schools more autonomy and giving them some leeway. It goes to a conference committee, and the conference committee was 3 senators and 3 House members. The Republicans excused themselves, came back in a little bit with a totally different bill. The one they came back with included the flex part of it, but they had added all of this stuff about the Accountability Act. And what they added was to set up a scholarship, a tax credit program and a scholarship program. Okay, it was passed, we were told. The reason for passing it was to help poor kids stuck in failing schools by their zip codes. We heard that over and over and over. We're going to help all these kids stuck in failing schools. I don't know if I guess some of the people saying that really believed it, but if you knew anything about education and where the failing schools were, you knew that wasn't the case. Among the things they did was, just arbitrarily, they said, okay, 6% of all the public schools, based on their reading and math scores, will be considered failing. That'd just be the cut line. We did not say, and to me, if 6% of the public schools are failing, then 6% of the private schools must be failing. I mean, it's an arbitrary number. But there are no failing private schools, according to the Accountability Act. Now, here's the way the whole thing works. I owe $10,000 to the state on my income tax. That's my state liability for income tax. I can make a contribution of up to half of that to a scholarship granting organization, which is known as an SGO. And the state will credit me for $5,000 in paying income tax. So I can pay $5,000, I can give Dan Fulton's SGO $5,000, and Julie McGee, the revenue commissioner, says, okay, you've just paid $5,000 in income tax. Well, here's the rub. That $5,000 that I didn't pay means that's $5,000 that did not go to the state and did not go to the Education Trust Fund. So we're diverting that money away from the Education Trust Fund. And as of today, we have now diverted, in the 3 years we had that program, over $71 million. Now, Alabama, so the argument there is it was never state money because I never sent it to the state. I sent it to the SGO instead. Because, as y'all know, constitutionally, we're not allowed to use public money for private schools. But that's how we get around that. And this is being done all over the country, and they refer to it as opportunity scholarships. So we just head it off before it gets to the revenue folks. There was a lawsuit then in, I don't know if it started in 13, was settled in 14. The Alabama Education Association sued in a circuit court in Montgomery, in Gene Reese's circuit court, and said it was unconstitutional. He ruled in favor of the lawsuit. And one of the grounds is that, one of the things they brought up, when you go to conference committee, you're not supposed to be able to substantially change the intent of the legislation. So the scholarship granting organization, the tax credit, that was not part of that legislation when it goes, when it went to conference committee. It was when it came out. Then that was appealed to the Supreme Court, and they overruled the lower court and said, no, it's all about education. Well, education becomes a huge catch-all, so to speak. Then what happened was, or let me just say this, schools that want to participate in the program have to go through a qualifying procedure with the State Department of Revenue. And today there's 195, as of yesterday, 195 private schools in the state who are willing to participate. They're not all getting scholarship, but they're willing to participate. And what you find Most of the Catholic schools in the state are part of the program. A lot of them, I don't know any, there may be some that aren't, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are church-related schools of some sort. What you don't find what I call, in most cases, the elite private schools. You won't find Montgomery Academy on here. You won't find Bayside Academy down in Baldwin County. You won't find St. Paul's in Mobile. And I find that kind of interesting. But I'll give you one example, one thing I know about. Several years ago, the state took over the Midfield school system out at Midfield. One of the first things they did was fire the principal. And
The superintendent.
no,
Yeah. Oh, the principal. Oh, yeah, high school.
the superintendent was gone, but the principal was fired by the state.
Right.
He today runs a private school in Bessemer and gets money from he participates in the scholarship granting organization program. And Tommy Bice said to me one day, he said, "Isn't it ironic that we fired this guy and now we sending him money?" And so anyhow, yes, sir.
I'm trying to follow the money. Looks like
Good luck.
Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, public money is going to private school.
In essence, right. It's just not, legally, it's not public money because it never got to the state to get to be labeled as public. But it's money being diverted from the education trust fund. Yes.
Did
Absolutely.
many students apply?
Ma'am?
Did many students from the failing schools apply?
Here's the deal. Okay, you get designated as a failing school. Today, there's 76 schools on that list. 20 total of 36,844 kids in those 76 schools. Their free and reduced lunch rate is 71.5. And I'm sure you know that there's a tremendous correlation between poverty level and student performance. The higher the poverty level, as a rule, the weaker the student performance. That's one of the reasons we had picked those 10 schools out, because they all had high poverty levels, but they were really performing well. Those 76 schools are 92.6% African American. Now, statewide, the demographics are 51.9% of the kids in Alabama are on free lunches, and only 33.1% of them are African American. So the failing schools are much, much higher on the poverty level and much, much higher on an African American population. And there's absolutely no surprise in that. That's what you expect. Okay, a child, I'm in a failing school. I can transfer to another school that's not a failing school within my school system. Or I can transfer to outside of my school system to a non-failing school. Or I can get a scholarship and go to a private school. All sounds good if everything matches. For instance, in Lowndes County, both the failing schools were junior high schools. Well, I have but 2 junior high schools in Lowndes County. In Lowndes County is Hayneville, and it's just outside of Montgomery, down there where I live. So there was not an option within the county to go. which means that for me to transfer to a non-failing public school, I had to go to Selma, to Greenville, or to Montgomery, which also means that somebody had to get me there. Because the child has to furnish their own transportation. There's not a private school in Lowndes County that was on the program. And if I found a private school there, again, I had to have my own transportation. So basically what we said to 400 children in Hayneville and Fort Deposit was, help is on the way. But it wasn't. And I think because of that, my thoughts on the Accountability Act is that it's morally corrupt. I have a real problem when I'm telling somebody, I'm going to help you, and I don't do it. Now, also, you would think that a law that's going to highlight failing schools would also say, and here's what we're going to do to help you. We're going to give you extra resources to hire counselors or to hire reading coaches or to do this or to do that. Nothing. Nothing at all. It just said, pat them on the head and wish them well. And I've likened it to, you have an elementary school, the school nurse takes everybody's temperature, and you got 20 kids that have got a fever, and she says, go back to your class and I hope you get the fever back. She doesn't give them an aspirin, they don't take them to the doctor, they find out about it and turn their back on. And that law was, a couple months after it was passed in 2013, was amended so that a local system could opt out of taking those children. And that's why you will find that there are none of those kids in some of the school systems real close to where we are today. And my friend Paul DeMarco and Jim Carnes are the ones that amended it to do that. So none of those kids that were in the failing school in Birmingham could transfer to Mountain Brook. Because Mountain Brook said, no, we're full. And so anyhow, and that had to be an action of the school board to do that. Okay, one thing. Okay, let's see where I am at my note taking today. Okay, today there are 6 SGOs operating in the state of Alabama. A scholarship granting organization. 2 of them are based out of state. They're both based in Georgia. And I'm wondering, they're running this. The reason somebody in Atlanta sets up a business in Alabama is to make money. Somehow they're making some money out of this. The 2 main ones is one called Scholarships for Kids that was set up here in Birmingham, and the other one is the Alabama Opportunity Scholarship Fund. It was set up by former Governor Bob Riley. Warren Callaway is the exec, runs the Scholarship for Kids. Good guy and a good friend. Leslie Searcy is the young lady that runs the other one, and she too is a good person. And I know Leslie. But here's the deal. The law allows that the SGO can keep up to 5% of whatever they raise for administrative and marketing. So 5% of $71 million has been sucked out of there. It's $3.5 or so million to pay salaries and to do robocalls and to print brochures and to talk about the SGO. The irony in that is what they talk about is how bad the public schools are. And it's ironic that we're actually taking money from the public schools to fund somebody to tell us how bad the public schools are. Because we've had articles talking about the waiting list of 12,000 parents that want to get their child on a scholarship thing. I've never seen the list. Maybe there is one, maybe there isn't. But the only way you get business is you gotta help create this sense that the public schools are not doing a very good job. Yes, sir.
Is there anything to separate the people that would donate to the SGO from the SGO? In other words, can I set up an SGO and donate to myself?
It's a long, involved law, and I think there is, because I've thought about something like, well, I'll set up one for my grandchildren or for a certain school. And I think that is prohibited or supposed to be prohibited. I'm not sure of that, but I do think there's something that there's a mechanism there. Yes, sir.
Now, a follow-up on that, is there any oversight into the procedure for awarding scholarships?
Well, I call it the Non-Accountability Act. Unfortunately, there's very little oversight. The oversight falls on the Department of Revenue, which, pass this, the law says that the children getting a scholarship will take the same state assessment that public school kids do, so we can look at scores. It says the SGO, the Scholarship Granting Organization, will gather those scores and send them not to the State Department of Education, but to the State Revenue Department. And Julie McGee, who is the Revenue Commissioner, a friend of mine, she says, we collect taxes. We're not in the education business. Well, that's now being put together, and I'm told that the SGOs are getting the testing information to the Department of Revenue. They have hired somebody out of the University of Alabama to analyze all of that. And that's supposedly it'll be available in September. I guess my first question is, well, how much are you paying to get it analyzed? And what is the analysis? I mean, how do you do that? But anyhow.
Let me ask you. Now, let's say a parent, they do homeschooling. I gather they don't get any help out of this at all, do they?
No, I don't think homeschooling is involved at all, Dan, in this. Okay, the law was passed in 2013. That first year, the Riley Group raised $17.8 million. Now, let me also say this. The Riley SGO is not operated by people in Alabama. It is solely owned by a group out of Florida called Step Up for Students. In fact, and I've got it here somewhere, of the 7 board members on the Riley SGO, the 7 members of the board for the Riley SGO, 4 of them are from Florida, including a gentleman named John Kirtley, Kirtley, who is the head honcho for the SGO down in Florida. Why they're operating, and I just this week pulled the most recent, I did not bring it with me. Y'all have know what a 990 form is. A nonprofit has to file with the IRS a 990 form, which is their income tax report. So I pulled the most recent one I could find was for 2014 for Step Up for Students. There's not one. Riley's crowd does not file one because in the one from Florida it says that we wholly own the one in Alabama. Which I just find kind of interesting. So they raised $17.8 million the first year But in one of the Step Up for Students reports, they say that 14 million came from 2 sources. So the contributors are not mom and pop. Now, Phil Rawls is now retired from the Associated Press in Montgomery. Philip is a longtime friend. Philip told me that he interviewed Governor Riley about all of this at one point. The first year he raised $17.8 million from 25 donors. So an average of about $750,000. But if you got 2 for 14, that's going to jump the average up real substantially. But the governor told Phil, he said, all of the donors are businesses, and most of them are companies that I helped recruit when I was governor. And Philip asked, are you going to make their names public? And Riley said, no. And he said the reason was that they would be criticized. Well, that stuck in my mind for a long time. And I kept saying, why would you be criticized for, helping school kids? Well, here's why, I think, is because you would see some of these names given to the public schools, the private schools rather, are some of the same companies that are always talking about how we need better public schools so we can have a better workforce. And I don't know if Airbus and Austell from Mobile are contributors to the governor's SGO, but those are 2 of the first names that popped into my mind because he was very involved in recruiting them. And I know if you have a meeting about workforce development in South Alabama, they're going to be there talking about it. So that's just trying to connect the dots, but it seems interesting that I'm going to be giving my money to private school scholarships, and I'm talking about how we need to make public schools better. But anyhow, the first year they raised 17.8. The scholarship for kids raised 6.3. Okay, they come back in 14, and that's when the lawsuit's going on. And the Riley folks only raised $652,000 the second year. And they said we couldn't raise any money because of the lawsuit. And it had our donors spooked. Well, it didn't spook the scholarship for kids donors because they went from 6.3 to 12.1 million. They come back last year. Okay, the original law capped the SGO donations at 25 million. And you can go on the Department of Revenue's website, as I do quite often, and you can see how much money has been contributed. It's kind of a running total there. So they came back last year to amend the law. And they said, because of the lawsuit, some of the people couldn't raise much money. And so we're going to let them raise money this year and let people contribute and count it against last year's tax liability. Well, they did. There was 2 or 3 million raised that way, but it never reached what they had hoped it would. And then they also raised the cap from 25 million last year to 30 million. Now understand this. Okay, the law says once I get a scholarship, it's kind of like a marriage. It's kind of to death do us part. I'm entitled to that scholarship so long as I'm in school. So I get a scholarship in the 1st grade, Mama expects me to keep it. Well, so that means however many scholarships you hand out in your 1st year, you need to run that fast to stay in place. Because that's the beast I've got to feed every year. So Riley goes from 17 million to 652,000 and they can't feed the beast. And the number of scholarships dropped a great deal, which means a lot of people that were getting scholarships didn't get one the second year, and they're probably saying, whoa, what went wrong? But anyhow, there's been so many things. When they came back last year in 2015 and amended the law, the first law, as I said, was all about helping poor kids stuck in failing schools by their zip codes. They amended the intent of the law. And I testified before a committee, and I said, this is the first time I've ever known of coming back and saying, we were wrong the first time, now we're going to tell you what we really wanted to do. And so they amended it to say this law is now all about school choice. It's not about helping kids in failing schools.
Jack Williams has told me that specifically. He said, well, it's all about, we want to give some folks some choice.
Well, anyhow. Yes, ma'am.
What's the source of the money for the, I think you said the scholarship for kids, not the Riley Fund, but if I heard you correctly, the scholarship for kids.
It's another SGO.
But where did their money come from?
Their money, I can't tell you specifically because they don't disclose it, but the same thing, they go out. They take money from you or me or from Alabama Power or whoever. They just, they're cultivating donors all the time. But I can't say specifically. And Warren Calloway, who runs that, is a good friend. And he and I know he won't talk to me and tell me that, and I'm not going to ask him. But I do know this. Okay. In April of 2015, over a weekend, I told you about the website that the revenue has, and you can track it. Over the weekend, a $10 million check hit that revenue stream. And I know this, Warren said, that wasn't my $10 million. I don't know where it came from. Somebody dumped $10 million in there. And most of this money comes in right at the end of the year, as you can imagine, when people are trying to adjust, make their decisions on their finances, which says to me that most of this is being done as a business procedure. The shots are being called by tax attorneys and by accountants. It's not being done because somebody has a warm place in their heart for little kids. Now, some of them do, I'm sure. But the big money, I don't believe that's what's going on with the big money. And I might also point out one thing. I talked about where these schools are, and they're all over the state. Birmingham has a number of them. We've now changed from the Alabama Reading and Math, which test we no longer give, to the ACT Aspire. So we've changed the mechanism that we look at to determine what the failing schools are. But you'll find this interesting. I mentioned that these schools are predominantly poor and predominantly black. The legislation was voted on in 2013, and I will say this, there was a lot of people, and they will tell you when they voted on it, they had no clue what they were voting on because it was rammed through. It was voted on by 51 white Republican House members and 22 white Republican senators. No Democrats or no blacks voted for the bill. Yes, sir.
I'm assuming that the AEA opposed that bill.
Yes, sir. They brought suit.
Yeah.
That was a suit.
That was the suit.
Right. That eventually got turned back, struck down.
Of course, the AEA isn't as influential as it was before 2010.
No, AEA is a shadow of its former self. But the reason I mentioned the demographics of those people who voted for it is, their schools weren't being impacted. I mean, how many, and listen, I've got a lot of good Republican friends. This is not a slam against them, but how many Republican school districts are majority poor? I mean, districts, their legislative districts are majority black and majority poor.
Amen.
So basically what I'm saying is we had a bunch of folks voting on something that they didn't think it was going to impact them. And that caused me some heartburn. Let's see. Okay, let's move along here before I flame totally out. And basically, what I think the Accountability Act was a lost leader for charter schools. Most of us have forgotten that we tried to pass a charter school bill in 2012, and it didn't get anywhere. Okay, we come back then the next year and we passed the Accountability Act by hook and crook. Okay, when I say I think it was a lost leader for this reason. If I'm a military and I'm going to invade a country, the first thing I do is not send in the infantry. I set offshore and I bomb, I send the big guns ashore and I fly the airplanes over and I try to soften up the enemy before I send the foot soldiers in. And so what did we hear initially out of the AAA? This is how terrible our public schools are. And then we come back then in 15 and we pass a charter bill that went through just like that. Because we'd had 2 years of rallies in Montgomery and other kind of stuff saying this is how terrible our public schools are. And what I find in charter schools, I'll talk a little bit about them. All the research that I've looked at, basically charter schools are pretty much just like public schools. There's some really good ones, there's some really bad ones, and there's a bunch of them that are somewhere in between. And when charter schools were originally conceived about the early 1990s, in fact, one of the principal conception people was Albert Shanker, who was head of the American Federation for Teachers. And he envisioned we're going to go into some tough situations where kids are really struggling. We're going to create a small school. We're going to turn the teachers loose to be as innovative as they can be. And then if they find things that work, then we're going to work in partnership with that local school system and see what is it we can adopt. Well, it didn't take long before Shanker saw that wasn't how the thing was going, and he pulled his support because it real soon turned into a competitive situation, which is what it is today. That charter schools are seen by the people who are running them as an effort to make some money.
Profit motivation.
Profit motive, that's right. And the internet is full of stories about abuse of the charter school program across the country. We have now created a charter school commission in Montgomery. Former State Superintendent Ed Richardson chairs that. And they have just a few days ago, there was 5 different entities that had given them said that we have potential intention of starting a charter school, and 3 of the 5 are in Alabama, 2 of them are outside the state, which I find kind of interesting if this is all going to be a local groundswell, so to speak. If you go on the state's website, you will see a menu box there on the opening page. It says public charter schools. where you can click on there and get all kind of information. But I can't figure out, okay, if there's such a thing as a public charter school, then it seems to me there must be such a thing as a private charter school. But nobody says there is, but the truth of the matter is, I really don't see how you can say that charter schools are public schools, because public schools, you have a chain of command, and you know that I can go to Brother Kelly back here if I got something that I'm concerned about in the Hoover school system and he's on the school board, I can talk to him. Charter school does not have that. They're getting public money, but they're not governed by that local school system. They set up their own governance group. And so, you know, the governance issue is something that I have an issue with.
Well, Larry, right at this particular point, there's not one charter school operating
No,
in Alabama.
it's anticipated that we may have one the fall of next year of 17. Yes, sir.
With the governance of the charter schools, what's the process by which people get on that commission or whatever it's being called for the governance of the charter schools?
Okay.
I'm sure they're not elected, but how do they
No.
get there?
Okay, the charter school legislation said, this is kind of funny, a good question. It said the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the house, the president pro tem of the city, it named a number of elected offices that would all have appointments to the charter school commission. It said that those appointments should be people who looked favorably upon charter schools. No surprise there. So, but for every person they got, the governor had, the lieutenant governor, whoever it was, sent 2 names over, and then to the state school board. Then the state school board had to pick one of the 2 names. So what happened last year, this all happened in June, as I remember. The state board has until the end of June to make their selection. They get to the regular school board meeting is the first Tuesday or the second Tuesday or Thursday of the month. I can't remember which. Thursdays, I think. The names all show up. The state board is sitting there looking at them. State board don't have a clue who these people are. It's just a name. So some of the state board members, and I particularly remember Stephanie Bell from Montgomery, saying we need more time to do some due diligence on who these people are. Well, Terry Collins is the state representative from Decatur who chairs the House Education Policy Committee. Well, she said, I'll just take my ball and go home. And so she had had legislation put together that said, well, we'll just take that process away from the State Board of Education, and we'll just let the governor name his person, not 2, and send it over to the state board. The state board said, look, we're going to do it and meet the timeline. We just want some time to make sure we're doing what we think is the right thing to do. And the state board prevailed in that case, but it's kind of an example of I'm going to take my ball and go home. Kind of, to me it's kind of childlike to say, well, y'all not going to do what we want you to do, so we'll change the policy. Local school boards can become what they call an authorizer for a chartered school. I think there was only 4 of them that did it around the state. Athens, Alabama did. I think Madison City did. Kathy Murphy, who is the Hoover superintendent, and I are longtime friends, and she told me when you read the law, it said an authorizer basically had to get out and try to sell the concept of charter schools. You had to go try to generate people to come in and put them in. And Kathy told me, she said, and Brother Kelly can talk about this. I'm sure they talked about it at great length. But Kathy said to me, why do I want to spend time trying to get competition? Said, we already doing a jam-up job. So she said, we're not going to become an authorizer. And most places chose not to do that. Let me close by talking about money just for a second. If I can get all my notes squared away here. One of the things, and you mentioned, Brother Goss, about AEA and their waning posture, and they're totally out of politics. And that void is trying to be filled, apparently, by the Business Council of Alabama. And I don't know that that's a good thing. And I went through a lot of records. In 2000, in the election of 2000, 16 years ago, BCA spent $5,000 is all on state school board races. You know, getting people. And we elect 4 state school board members every 2 years. There's 8 on there who are elected, and they're alternate. They alternate. So in 2000, they spent $5,000 this year. And we got 4 of those seats up this year. BCA has spent $353,000. Last 2 years ago, they spent $245,000. So they're spending lots and lots of money trying to get people elected to the State Board of Education. This year, they put money into 3 races, and 2 of them got defeated. And one of them they put a lot of money into was trying to defeat Stephanie Bell from Montgomery. And that they had a young fellow up here, I didn't know him, named Justin Barkley. They put a ton of money into him.
I got a flyer almost every day.
Well,
yeah, you know, of course, we got nothing from Stephanie Bell, but I mean, they just really put money into his campaign.
Like 2 years ago, in 2014, Bob Riley had a PAC called Alabama 2014. Of course, Mike Hubbard had a PAC he called Storm PAC. And then BCA had their PAC called Progress PAC. Those 3 entities 2 years ago spent $5.1 million on legislative races in Alabama. Then, 2 years ago, we also had money being spent by a group called Students First, which is an organization started by a lady by the name of Michelle Rhee, who lives in Sacramento, California. She was one-time chancellor of Washington, D.C. school system, started this group. They spent money, about $200,000 in 14 on legislative races. They do not file any paperwork with the Secretary of State, so you cannot find where their money's coming from. Have to take that up with John Merrill. I don't understand how that happens. You also had 2 years ago a group called Alabama Federation for Children that came into Alabama, headed by a young fellow named Ryan Cantrell. Ryan is a former Senator Marsh, a staff person. They spent a chunk of money. They spent $350,000 2 years ago, I think it was. All of their money comes from out-of-state millionaires. None of their money was raised in state. And you had a lady named Betsy DeVos from Michigan, whose husband is Dick DeVos, who's heir to Amway. You had the Walton folks, the Walmart people in Arkansas, putting a chunk of money into it. You had a real estate developer named William Orendorf, I think it is, in California, that put money into it. And you know, I sit here and I say, why is somebody in California spending money to elect people in Alabama? And I've often said, Would somebody explain to me why? One morning, this cat in San Francisco wakes up, says to his wife, "Honey, I just didn't sleep well last night because I'm so concerned about those little youngins in Wilcox County, Alabama. And I'm going to write a check for $100,000 and send it to Alabama and try to help them." And I just, it's all about the money. And where it gets real interesting is, I mentioned the name John Kirtley, who runs Step Up for Children in Florida. He's also the vice chair of the American Federation for Children, which the Alabama Federation is part of. The chairperson for the group in Washington is Betsy DeVos, who's the Michigan multimillionaire. And you get to looking at all this stuff, and it reminds you of going to a family reunion to look for a date. You just start, these same names start showing up in lots of different places. And a lot of it is linked back to Jeb Bush and his Foundation for Educational Excellence. Terry Collins, I mentioned, is the chairperson for our Education Policy Committee. She's a member. She's active in the Foundation for Education Excellence. Believes in it a great deal. There are 13 members of the Education Policy Committee in the House, 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats. Riley, BCA, Hubbard, Students First, and Alabama Federation for Children last year, in those 9 campaigns, invested $603,394. In the Democrats, that was total. Republicans, they invested $595,000. In the Democrats, they invested $8,000. So, if you're a Democrat, don't go to that group looking for financial support. And I think all of that $8,000 was BCA money. Well, I've overstayed my welcome. Yes, sir.
If you donate money to the SGO in lieu of state taxes,
Right.
and you get credit as having paid state taxes,
Right.
this did work a while ago. Working now? I don't. Does that
Yeah,
work?
there
Okay.
it is.
So, if you donate money to the SGO and you get credit as though you had paid your state taxes, can you now take that state tax contribution that you didn't make and deduct that from your federal income tax?
Yes.
And can you at the same time take a deduction on the federal income tax for a charitable contribution?
Yes.
So you can double count it.
You can double dip.
That sounds like a sweet deal.
Yeah, you actually make money on your, I've talked to some accountant friends of mine, and they've told me far more than I understood. There's somebody that writes columns fairly regularly. First name is Stewart. He's an accountant, financial advisor here in town. Welch. And he's written before about how this is free money, and how people ought to take advantage of it. The lady who keeps up with what little money I have is a CPA in South Alabama, and she talks about how she's gotten mailings about, tell your people about you ought to take advantage of this and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's not a bad deal. Any other questions? Nancy?
Tell us what RAISE is.
What RAISE is?
RAISE is and what it became and how.
And I'll try to do this real quickly. In the last session of this year, Senator Morris, Dale Morris, the Speaker Pro Tem, came up with a bill that the acronym was RAISE, R-A-I-S-E, rewarding something, I can't remember what it was. But anyhow, it was 49 pages initially, and I've looked at a lot of legislation, and it was sloppy. It was bad. and it was not put together well, the ideas were not proven. Basically, okay, it was linked, they had two pieces, really two things in there. One was something called the Longitudinal Data Center to create a statewide data collecting deal. They thought that would help sweeten support for the whole bill. Didn't work. They pulled the Longitudinal Data Center out. Terry Collins sponsored it as a separate bill. It failed before it was all said and done. The biggest bugaboo with the RAISE acronym, he originally had it tied to a raise for teachers. And so that was what they were going to fly it under. We're going to get teachers a raise. But one of the really objectionable things was they were going to require use of something that's referred to as VAM, V-A-M, Value Added Modeling. And this is a system that has got more bugs in it than a dumpster. It's been tried all over the country, and basically it's where you look at test scores of students and you evaluate their teacher on how the students perform. And like I say, this has just got all kind of bugs in it. Florida can tell you, I listened to a guy on YouTube one night who was a teacher in Florida. He said our system, it projected what each student, what their score should be. And he said one young lady in his class, her projected score was 3 points above perfect. I'm serious. She made a perfect score, and I want to say it was 83. They had projected she should make it 86. He said, I got deducted because the young man made a perfect score, but it was not the erroneous score that they had projected for her. And so you have all of that sort of stuff. Teachers went crazy, as you can imagine. There was a tremendous amount. There was a young fellow who was a teacher in South Alabama in the Mobile area at Saraland, and he put up a petition on change.org and quickly got 5,000 signatures saying, oh, we don't want to do this. Jennifer Brown, a good friend of mine, teaches at Vestavia High School. She's a science teacher. She was teacher of the year for this past year. Great lady, and very passionate about her profession, about her schools and her students. And she came unglued about that whole thing and really called in the dogs on a bunch of, I don't think that Senator Marsh had any idea that he was going to run into the pushback that he did. Because remember, last year they passed the charter school thing, they passed the Accountability Act. They were just cruising along. And here's among the things that was crazy. My friend Eric Mackey, who's a former school superintendent in Jacksonville, Alabama. Eric is the executive director of the School Superintendents Association. He was trying to negotiate through this long process about this bill and get things out of it and change it and everything else. The person he was negotiating with was a guy named Blake Harris, who is executive in Alabama for Students First. Blake Harris is an attorney here in Birmingham somewhere. I've never laid eyes on him. And has absolutely no education background. And he was who Eric was having to sit down and deal with. And you know, that'd be like me going over to UAB and trying to tell some doctor how to do open heart surgery. I don't know anything about it. And so anyhow, long story made short, they had a hearing in the Senate. I was there that day. It passed on a 5-4 vote to go to the floor of the Senate. Paul Bussman, a Republican from a dentist up in Coleman and a good guy, he bucked the Republicans. He did not vote with the Republicans. And the next week, he got jerked off the Rules Committee for being independent, I guess you would say. But what was interesting that day was that as they voted, and the last person to vote in that committee meeting was Shay Shelnut from the north end of the county here, that's a senator, who is a former educator, I'm told, and his wife, I believe, is a teacher now. It was 4-4, and it came to Shay, and he voted in favor of it, 5-4. Jennifer came unglued. And that's on a Tuesday, and she sicked a bunch of her friends on that poor boy. And by Saturday, he had put on her Facebook page, I think it was, "I've changed my mind. Get them off my back." And so they heard from an awful lot of people in education. And I think education finally, to some degree, drew the line in the sand on that bill. And it ended up that Marsh pulled it, and they never even brought it to the floor of the Senate. He abandoned it, which was good for education. It was terrible. It was bad legislation.
Larry, now isn't the state board under a lot of pressure on their selection of the new superintendent?
Yes, that's as you know, Dr. Bice, who was a state superintendent, resigned end of March, and is now working here in Birmingham with the Goodrich Foundation. Tommy's a great guy. The state board has now got to pick a new superintendent. They had originally 12 applicants, one of whom withdrew, so that left them with 11. The state board met last week and picked 6 of those to interview. Those interviews will be held on August 4th in Montgomery at a public, and that'll be public. And then they will vote on the 11th at their next regular scheduled board meeting for how they proceed. The applicants are Craig Pouncey, who is the Jefferson County Superintendent, is one of the finalists, if you will. Janet Womack, who is the Florence City Superintendent, is a finalist. Dee Fowler, who is the Madison City Superintendent, is a finalist. A gentleman from California by the name of Williamson Evers, Evers, or Bill Evers. He works for the Hoover Institution. He is a finalist. As best I can tell, has never been in a classroom. He has always worked at the higher education level, never been a teacher. He could not be hired in Alabama as a principal because he doesn't have any credentials. Gina Ross, who is the executive for the early childhood programs, she's a cabinet member. She is a finalist. And then a gentleman named Michael Sentas, Sentace, I believe it is, from Massachusetts, who at some point was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, which I think is an appointed position by their governor. He is not an educator by training. He's an attorney by training. But you can see all this information on the Secretary of Education state website, their letters of recommendation, their resumes, and that sort of thing. But this process seems to be being highly politicized, which I think in some ways is perhaps unfortunate, but an awful lot of people weighing in on who it ought to be. Yes, sir.
Well, this is kind of a step back looking at a bigger picture. This Republican legislature that we have now, not to say that the Democrats, when they were in power, were all that enlightened, but I'm concerned on a number of levels, but one of them is that since the AEA has lost so much influence. Now, I'm getting the vibe that they're going after the RSA too.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I guess I just don't like Republicans.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm often accused of being one or the other. Usually I'm accused of being a Democrat, and I told the Republican club I met with here a year or two ago, the only elected office I have ever held was 1,000,000 years ago when I was elected member of the Jefferson County Republican Executive Committee. I've never been elected as a Democrat to anything, but it's not that was many years ago, 40 years ago. The Republican Party today is not the one that I was part of, I don't think.
Well, it just seems like they don't know the detail. They don't know the ramification of legislation that they pass. And that works against everything.
My concern, and I told Governor Bentley this one day, he said, I'm looking for innovative ideas. And I said, I got one. He said, what is it? I said, why don't you listen to the experts? Why don't you listen to the teachers and the principals? He said, that is an innovative idea. Did he do it? No, I don't think so.
It's never done.
But that's my concern, is that, those 10 principals that we got to know so well back there in 2008, most of whom are retired or gone. Now only 2 of them are still in the same school. Those are sharp people. And why in the world you don't listen to those kind of folks is just totally beyond me. But that's what goes on in Montgomery, is we don't seek input from the folks that I think need the raise bill. There is no way that the legislature would come up with a bill telling UAB how to run their hospital without talking to some doctors. But yet we come up with all this education legislation, and the educators are the last ones to know anything about it. Tommy Bice had no clue about the Alabama Accountability Act till it was done. And Dale Marsh said we purposefully did not let people in education know what we were doing because they may have been opposed to it. And I'm like, the hell you say?
It's because it's all about the dollar bill.
I think that has a lot to do with it. Listen, yes, sir, you got a question?
I'm coming at this from a really different area or angle, I'll put it that way. It's what happens that's the results of what's happened over the years. I grew up in the Birmingham school system, and you and I are about the same age. I'm probably just a little bit older than you are, but we had a great school system. My first year in engineering school at Alabama was a piece of cake because of the elementary school and high school on the western side of town where I grew up were fantastic. The teachers were wonderful.
Inslee or
It was
Fairfield?
Inslee High School,
Yeah.
and I grew up in Wild. Yes. So now I've been going out to Donaldson Prison as a volunteer since I retired, and actually since before that, and see the most pitiful situations you have ever seen. The average at Donaldson Prison, which is a level 6 maximum security prison, is right at a 4th grade level, 3rd to 4th grade level. It's so pitiful. No education, no opportunities, and trying to put a stop to this, it's not going to be done there. It's going to be done eventually backing back to where the kids are coming up. And I was so impressed with what you had to say about the teachers and their attitudes and the principals and their attitudes of the poorest but better performing schools that you had an opportunity to see. I applaud those people. That's wonderful.
Well, the thing that, and you make an excellent point, and I wrestle with this, you know, how do you break the cycle of generational poverty? And I could tell you stories that you wouldn't believe. George Hall is a little inner city school in downtown Mobile that I have visited many times, a marvelous school. I'm sitting in the principal's office several years ago, Terry Tomlinson, she's now retired, and she said, just out of the blue, she said, you know what we need? I said, I don't know. She said, we need a shower. I said, Terry, you're K through 5, you don't have a football team. Why do you need a shower? She said, you won't believe how many of these kids come from homes where the water's been turned off. Now, every time I talk to the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or the Lions Club, I always start off by saying, everybody didn't have running water this morning, raise your hand. And no hands have ever gone up. And it's just hard for a lot of us to relate. But the situations that we see, oh Lord, there's a wonderful story on AL.com today. And I'll probably blog about this, but it's about a gentleman and his wife. He's works for the sheriff's department in Shelby County, and about how they've got 3 children of their own. They just adopted a child, a little girl. How they work with foster kids, and almost all of them are kids coming out of a substance abuse situation. And methamphetamine is rampant, and it's rampant in rural Alabama. I was standing in a fall festival in Fruithurst Elementary one night, and the principal said to me, and it was a room full of mamas and daddies, and as I said, there wasn't any manicures in that room. Or excuse me, there wasn't any pedicures in that room. These were people that earn their living with their hands, laying water pipe and asphalt and stuff. And there's nothing in the world wrong with that. But the principal said to me, he said, probably 25% of these people have a drug problem. And drugs are they're just tremendously, every school you go in, you talk to the principal, talk to the counselors about the kids that are, you know, they're coming to school, they don't come, this ain't the land of Ozzie and Harriet anymore. And too often in Montgomery, I think we think that it still is. And they're just, and I will have legislators say, well, it's all about the family. Yes, it is. But who's going to stand at the front door of the school and say, everybody with a mom and daddy at home line up over here, and everybody that doesn't have 2 parents at home line up over here, and all y'all can't come to school? I mean, the mission of public schools is we gotta take them. I went a few years ago, I was at Morris Slingloff Elementary School in Dothan, an elementary school. Teresa Davis at that time was the principal. She had 16 kids on feeding tubes. 16. Now what does that do to you cost per student? It goes out the roof. And we put all those kids in our public schools. I asked a friend of mine that works for a very good private school in Montgomery one day, I said, how many guidance counselors? No, I said, how many special ed teachers do y'all have? She said, none. We don't have any special ed kids. Well, when you segment them like that, it makes it easy for some things to look good. Yes, sir.
I'm a retired social worker with special needs children, and Coleman County was I was the one assigned social worker for all the special needs children in Coleman County. And of course, we serviced them in the medical treatment here in Birmingham and clinics. We visited the homes. There was a child development center in Coleman that we visited to make sure to help the teachers with what they needed. But my solution is to have more social workers in the public schools. And they can interact with families, go to the homes of the families, follow that child through their years, and make sure probation does not lead to prison. And the profession changes so much from year to year, and I'm retired, but there's just so much in the social work profession that is just kind of flicked away. If you've got a guidance and counseling person in your school, well, send them to the guidance and counseling office down the hallway. Well, they never speak with the parent, they never visit the home. There's no follow-up or interaction between a child and a caring person.
And who's gonna pay all the social workers in the state of Alabama?
Well, they don't pay them much. I think they
Oh,
can
I know
afford.
that, because my daughter was one.
Well, y'all have been a great crowd, and I appreciate y'all coming out to listen. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Look, Goss,